Welcome to the Dr. Tim Stauffer podcast. I'm your host, Sam Meyung. This podcast is dedicated to helping people think deeply about identity, faith, culture, relationships, and more. We hope that you will find our content useful and engaging in designing your values-driven life. Enjoy, and thanks for listening. If you find this podcast helpful, please subscribe and share it with your friends. If you're interested in more resources or personal coaching, please visit www.drtimstauffer.com. Tim is a licensed professional clinical counselor and certified executive and life coach. The content of this podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For counseling needs, please seek the advice of your licensed mental health provider. All right, Tim, we're back.
Hey, it's so fun to be back. It's been a long time, and what has it been? About a year or so, or maybe a little longer
since we've recorded an episode. So it's fun to be doing this again. And
so it's fun to reboot it, and a lot has certainly happened in both of our lives in the past year. But
true,
really looking forward to kind of getting back into a cadence and into a rhythm of recording and releasing episodes. And
absolutely,
it's fun. So to all you listening, welcome aboard and welcome back, and hope that you find it to be helpful and useful, and pass it along to your friends.
And if you noticed, the name has changed a little bit, and we got a new graphic. The Dr. Tim Stauffer podcast is what we're going for now, and we'll talk a little bit more about that kind of as this episode goes along, because over the past year, you've had some significant changes as far as what you feel like you are supposed to be doing with your life.
Sure.
And kind of the rebrand is a little bit a part of that. And so excited to...
For sure. It's like one of those things. When I was younger, I'm going to be turning 50 here shortly. And I remember years ago, probably 20 years ago, back in my late 20s or early 30s, I was often thinking, you know what, by the time you're 50, you kind of got life figured out. And that's not true. We seem to always go through these stages of life of kind of what's next, like what's out there in front of us. And in many ways, I think that's a good thing to never lose touch. If I ever get to the place where I just feel satiated and content and have no sense of vision or purpose for something beyond where I'm at today, that I think would be a sad day. Mm-hmm. And so I'm excited about some new directions and new ideas, and we'll talk, like you said, we'll talk about that more. Partway through the episode. That
sounds great. And a part of that would be, you thought it would be beneficial to kind of share your story. Kind of how you have come to the point where you are right now. And when we talked about doing this episode, the name you wanted to give this one was The Making of a Sex Addiction Therapist. And I was like, I love that name, or like that title for this, because that's just so, it's like, how does somebody become a sex addiction therapist? Like, how do you get into that? I mean, you really are, like, for people who don't know you or what you do, is like you are a very accomplished, recommended professional in this area. And so in many regards, I don't think I'm speaking incorrectly when I say this, in Columbus at least, like you are the guy, like, is from my understanding, from my viewpoint. So how do you get to that place?
Well, it's a fascinating journey. I sometimes ask myself that same question. And I thought, well, in many regards, that is kind of been the focus of my career in many regards for the past decade or more. And perhaps recounting that story and kind of pointing how will that influence and predict or point towards what I'm going to continue to do. And it's been a struggle at times, because there's times I never angled for this sense of be the sexpert, or that if you have significant sexual issues, why don't you call Tim? Like that's you don't aspire to that,
right?
At least I
don't. In middle school, when you were asked, Tim, what do you want to be when you grow up? This isn't what you responded with?
Well, it's like there's no... like, if you want to kill a conversation, tell people in the airplane that's what I do.
I feel like it's that, and then right underneath it is telling people you're a pastor. It's like those two.
Those two. It's like, oh, well, how about we change the subject? At one level, that's true, but it depends on how you talk about it, or depends on how you say it.
Sure.
Because there are many conversations I had where I would have anticipated that people would want to close off the conversation. It's almost like it opens up this sense of like, tell me more. I'm curious. I want to learn. I want to know more, because we all know at a very intuitive and deep level that human sexuality is one of the most powerful elements of the human experience.
Sure.
And it's very deep, and it's very primal. And it's the struggle with sexuality and understanding sexuality is a complicated endeavor. And anyone who's parenting children is going to recognize that challenge of how do we talk to our kids? How do we engage with our spouse in a sexually meaningful way, and so that it's a life-giving force in our relationships? And so all of those places are elements of struggle for people. And so there's a curiosity and a need and a desire to really understand and to make that part of our lives congruent with our values, to be life-giving, and to oftentimes heal the pain that's associated with that. So with that area. So I thought maybe to really start that story about how I got into this position, we have to go back probably to adolescence. As a middle adolescent, maybe 15, 16, 17 years old, my faith was really crucial to me. It was very important. I came to know the Lord in my home church as a young boy. I made my commitment to following the Lord, and throughout my adolescence, I began to have this deep sense that I think God is calling me to ministry in some form or fashion. I felt a call towards helping people, towards I wasn't sure if it was pastoring, counseling. I grew up in a very conservative subculture in the Mennonite church. And so within that space, the idea of going to college was not encouraged. In fact, I wouldn't say it was actively discouraged, but it certainly raised people's eyebrows in my home community of be careful. You go to college, you're going to lose your faith. There was a great deal of apprehension about the academic world.
Sure. And
a real push to just go out into the world and make your fortune in the blue collar industries that don't require college education. And so I really had no mechanism or really help in thinking through what does it mean to engage in ministry. I also grew up in a church context where people didn't prepare to be a pastor. Like, you didn't go for training. Pastors were just selected, like from the congregation. There would be people would kind of nominate people they thought would make a good pastor or deacon, and they'd put all the names in different Bibles or different songbooks, and it was called the lot. And those people would go up front one Sunday morning and pick a book, and if they got the one with the piece of paper in it, hey, welcome to Pastor Joe. You're now a pastor. That's what you are. And so how do you, if you feel called to ministry, there was no mechanism for me and so I didn't know how to think it through.
Sure.
So that's where I think it started. It certainly wasn't, the idea of sex addiction wasn't even in my understanding or vocabulary that there was such a thing.
And when you use the word ministry, was it like primarily a desire to like help people, or like be used in seeing other people, I don't know, be cared for?
I think so. I think there was a sense in which I had a tender heart as a young boy. I wanted to help people. I believed that faith was an important part of helping people, and so I was captured very early by curiosity and by a real interest in the kingdom of God and the sense that the work of Christ. And so my orientation to life from very young has been to bring my life into alignment with God's purposes for me, for that creative purpose. And so that's kind of ministry felt like help. I want to help people heal. I want to help people be well. I want to help people thrive and to flourish. And I didn't have much vocabulary at that time. I was young and naive and passionate and zealous. And so the Lord began to take me on a fascinating journey. And when I was 19 years old, I decided to volunteer as a chaplain's assistant in a state penitentiary in Alabama. And so there was a prison ministry that staffed chaplains in the area penitentiaries. So I volunteered and went there. And 19 years old, I got in my car and I like one of the three little pigs, just left the home and headed out into the world to find my way, and started working in the prison system, and began to run into a lot of people's stories are really complex. And one of the leaders of the prison ministry told me, like, if you want to be in ministry and help people, you can cut your teeth in the prison. Like, doing work in a penitentiary will prepare you for any other form of ministry. And I think he was right. It was a formative year in my life, disproportionately to almost any other year. I look back, and it's been 30 years ago now that I moved there, and I'm like, that year still holds disproportionately large space of influence in my life. And so that's where I really began to develop my desire and my skills and my sense of helping people. While I was there, one of the local pastors had an affair with a church secretary. And it just was devastating to the community, to her life, to the ministry areas in which they were involved. And it may have been one of the first times where I, as an adult or as a young adult, I began to see the chaos of sexual brokenness and infidelity and just those processes. And I remember being there and thinking, Tim, you could do that. And it was like this deep awareness that I have the capacity to go that direction. Like that could be me. And it was a humbling and sobering time. And I remember making this prayer, or saying this prayer. I said, God, take me the long way so that I have the character to sustain your call in my life. And I look back and I feel a sense of I'm proud of myself with that prayer.
You should be.
I look back and I'm like, that is a prayer that
is dripping in wisdom.
Was wise beyond my years, beyond my education. I think it was a prayer that didn't even come from me. I think it was inspired. I think there was a sense in which.
Can you say it again?
Lord, take me the long way, so that I have the character to sustain your call. And I think it was just rooted in this deep understanding that that could be me. I can see how I could get there. And I don't want to go there.
Yeah.
And
you're talking like something like that
like pastor, like having that affair. Like it's like I don't want my life to track in that direction.
Yeah.
And that became, as I reverse engineer my life and my thinking, that became the place around which I began to design life, and to be in congruence with my values and with my sense of direction and where God is leading us to go. And as I reflect back on it and I think about what are the things that help us have a life of congruence, whether that's sexually or in any other domain of life, is we need a force outside of ourselves to help us develop our character, because we know at a very deep level our own capacity to go off the rails, to hurt other people, to let our appetites run wild and be out of control. It's like we'll do it with food, we'll do it with sex, we'll do it with money, it's like our appetites, and they are powerful. And we often use, when all else fails in our life, we'll turn to our appetites and let our appetites be the driver of the bus of our life. And in many regards, that's part of the problem of sexuality. It's part of the problem of food. It's part of the problem of money and gambling. It's like our appetites, drug problems, addiction. All of those things are a place in which we turn to our appetites to solve much, much deeper questions and deeper problems. And so fundamentally, it's like that prayer of, I need to go the long way. And I think part of that is like we have to recognize that the development of character takes time. And the development of congruence in our lives is a process across time. And that for me started in that prayer in Alabama. Fast forward, I moved back home from Alabama when I was 20 and was confused and young and didn't have a clear sense of direction, didn't know how to get where I was going, didn't have a real clear sense of where I'm going. I didn't really know. I didn't have a career track in mind. In many ways, I really even prepared for that question of like, I wasn't thinking of in terms of career. I trusted God. I was like, God will provide, and I just don't have to worry about it. And so I didn't know which way to go. So I moved back home, went back to work, started going to a small Bible college, just taking classes and working towards the 2 years, kind of the equivalent of an associate's degree in Christian ministry. And then I started dating my wife. We got married, and I hadn't gone to school. I hadn't finished my degree, and so I'm working in a hardware store. Our first baby's coming. I have no sense of how I'm going to move from being 27 years old, no college degree, and no real sense of prospect of what's next. I have no idea. And so I just remember saying to my wife, if I'm going to ever finish college, I better get after it now, because there's a baby on the way. And we talked to someone we really trusted, and they just said, they lived here in Ohio, and they said, well, why don't you move to Ohio, go to Cedarville, and then move on to grad school? And we looked at each other and said, okay, that's what we'll do. And we sold our house in Pennsylvania and took all of the money we had and moved to Ohio, and I started working on my psychology degree at Cedarville University, and finished my degree and took a job as a dean of students at the Bible college I attended.
So at that point, why did you choose psychology? Like, why was that the thing you ended up choosing?
Well, it was in that space where it was in those years of meandering where I began to clarify counselor or pastor. Okay. Those two seem to be two broad paths or two distinct pathways. There's some overlap between them, but sure. But I began to be tilted towards the counselor side. One of my mentors in Alabama was working on his counseling degree when I was there, and so I was certainly tilted. I was working in what I would sometimes is called the para-church ministry. So I wasn't working for a church or in a church. I was working in the larger ministry area, and so counseling is much more of the para-church space, and so that was the direction I began to track, and so I finished my psychology degree and started working as the dean of students at a small Bible college. And in that time, kind of really got burned out, and just like I got jaded and was frustrated. I working with people. I remember walking home one day and thinking, I don't like people anymore. Like they're just, people are difficult. People don't listen. People don't change. I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm done helping people. I tried that for the last 4 years, and
what's the old adage? Ministry would be great if it wasn't for the people.
Yes. It's teachers will sometimes say that too. It's like teaching would be great if it wasn't for the kids. And so there was certainly that element of I started to run into myself and into my expectations and into what I hoped for, and so I decided I should go into business and do something else. And so I left the college position and took a job working as a manager of a Tim Hortons coffee shop franchise. And I was thinking, well, maybe I'll buy a franchise someday and I'll have a ministry in my local community, just serving the community. Well, it didn't take long until that completely ran into a wall. This was not a good fit for me. And it was in that one day I felt, it was in 2008. I had a clear sense of, I would say it was one of those spiritual moments of clarity where it was like 3:45 in the morning. I was tying my shoes to get ready to go to the coffee shop because I had to start crazy early hours. And I remember it was felt like a near audible voice of, Tim, I want you to quit your job and go get your counseling degree. And I remember thinking, that's a tough thing to do. I have 3 kids. I have a mortgage. I have no money. I don't know how that's going to work. And long story short, that's what we did. I quit my job and I went back to school full time to get my master's degree in clinical counseling. And in 2011, I opened my private practice, and I stole furniture from my house because I had no money to get started. We were so incredibly broke and in debt. And yet I've needed to launch a practice, and by the grace of God and the help of people who loved us and cared about us, they helped me get started. And I took the couch from our house and set up my office. And I said, Lord, I've done everything that I know to do to obey what I believe you called me to do. Bring the people that you want me to see.
Yeah.
And people started coming. And many of the people that started to come, certainly not all, but many of the people started coming to see me, were grappling with issues of sexuality and sexual addictions, and couples that were reeling from the effects of pornography use in their marriage, and infidelity, and all sorts of sexual struggles and sexual brokenness and pain and trauma. And I was quickly recognized that I have not been adequately prepared for the stories that I'm listening to, for this was new. Yeah. This was new territory for me. It's like I had someone come and say, I've been soliciting prostitutes for the past 30 years. Can you help me stop? And I put on my counselor bobblehead and just like nodding. Yeah, I think I can help you do that. And I'm like internally saying, I have nothing in grad school has prepared me for that question. Wow. Like I am ill prepared for this. And so I did what competent people do when they're in over their head. I went and got more training. And so from those experiences and from those people that were seeking my help for issues of counseling, I started a training program or a certification program as a sexual recovery therapist with the American Association for Sex Addiction Therapy. And I went through their training program and their supervision process and earned certification in that field. And then the word began to spread, and I met with pastors and people and said, here's what I'm doing. And over time, my phone began to ring to the point where I was full and I couldn't take on new people. Yeah, and so that's kind of been, that's the that's the short story of how I became a sex addiction therapist. And today I'll have people refer their clients to me, and they'll say, oh yeah, therapist so-and-so or doctor so-and-so sent me your way. And I'm like, I have no idea who that doctor so-and-so is, but
yeah, wow.
People,
when you got other counselors or doctors recommending them to you, I feel like that means something.
Well, it is, and it is one of those areas where within the counseling world, we have this ethical mandate to not work outside of the scope of our practice. And so as a licensed therapist, you might be licensed to do something, but that's not an automatic green light to be able to do it.
Okay.
It's like you have to there are some areas that require specialization and special training. Yeah. And so you can't just do it even though you're licensed to do it. Like, for example, there's a form of therapy called EMDR, and I'm not trained to do EMDR, but I'm licensed to do it. It's like by license, I can do EMDR. But I'm not trained in it. I don't know how. I don't know. So it's like it's not, and so it would be unethical for me to just kind of read a book about EMDR and then start practicing in it and call myself that because I'm licensed to.
Got it.
And so sex addiction therapy is similar to some degree. There are many very competent therapists that would just say, that's beyond the scope of my practice. I want you to see a specialist. Yeah. And so that's part of why there's not many people in the Columbus area that are certified in sex addiction recovery. Yeah. And so that's kind of how I became a sex addiction therapist.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fascinating. Now I know, like, in some conversations I've had with you, like you kind of alluded to this at the beginning of our conversation. So like, honestly, sometimes even a sense of embarrassment of like titling yourself this way. You mind talking about that a little bit? Like why, like what that struggle has been for you, and why that's been the case?
Sure. I think that one of the things that's very common as it relates to issues of sexuality is the issue of shame. It's very difficult in our culture to have a deep and serious conversation about issues of sexuality. In many regards, there's times in which it sometimes feels like our culture is a bit schizophrenic about the issue. It's like, on one side, sex is free and open and available and celebrated, and yep. Whatever your fantasy, whatever your impulses, whatever your desires, live it up. The movies are filled with sex. The advertising's filled with. It's like sex is everywhere, and in many regards, our culture is very pornographic in its approach. It's very objectifying, and it uses sex to sell, and it's effective. And so there's a sense in which there's this deep celebration of fulfill your appetites and do whatever you want. And then people will start to do that. And then they'll find out that, my wife isn't quite happy with that approach. Or this doesn't actually work as well as what we think. And so now sex becomes very painful. And sexuality, it's like it's starting to hurt us at other dimensions of our life. And so to have a deep and serious conversation about sex often makes people blush. It's like to talk about sex and sexuality in a very, what I would say, a sex positive way that just grapples with the challenges that people face related to sexuality. People very quickly are about how about we don't talk about it, but let's go to the movies and watch it. Let's celebrate it. Let's laugh about porn. Let's laugh about, and so there's this real divide. And I've certainly have felt the tension of like, oh, what happens if people think I'm a sex addict? And so I remember going one time to teach, not a workshop, but just to do a little presentation at a sex addiction recovery group. And it was at a local church. And I remember just walking getting in the parking lot. And all of a sudden it occurred to me, I am going out into a public space. I am going to walk into the church, and I'm going to find the signs, or I'm going to ask for directions that point me to the group for sex addiction. And I remember thinking, I don't want to do that. I don't want people to see me going there. I don't want to. And it's like, I was working in this area for quite some time. And what struck me is like, my clients would talk to me about their shame. And I'm like, oh, we all feel a level of shame related to struggles of sexuality, whether we're sex addicts or not. To have a serious conversation about the challenges of sexuality require certain conditions for it to be safe and for it to be effective. And so yeah, it's a challenging and difficult space. People are hungry to talk about it. Like, I suspect that this episode will be listened to
just
from the title and from the sense of curiosity. It's like when people are curious. And in many regards, if we think back to our development, go back to puberty, go back to childhood, there is something very curious in the hearts of people, in the lives of people. We're very curious about the body. We're very curious about difference. It's like there's a mystery related to the human body that creates a level of curiosity sexually that starts very, very young.
Yeah. And
it's like that curiosity doesn't just go away. It's like, and so it catches people's attention. And for some people, they're so ashamed of sexuality. It's like, to talk about it is a problem. Like, you shouldn't even have a productive kind of or a serious conversation about it. And people faith grapple with that all across the spectrum. People who don't profess faith grapple with the issues of sexuality, and it's a universal human reality.
Yeah. Well, kind of off of that, what do you feel like are some of the things that you have learned over the time, or throughout your life, through your story, coming to where you are with your career now, and what are some of the things you've learned through the midst of that? Obviously, there's a lot. It's a whole lifetime.
Sure. Well, I think in many regards that begins to point the direction of where I'm headed in my career. Yeah. I want to help people think through how to design a life where their sexuality is congruent with their values. And in many regards, there's if I put it in terms of like pornography, there's this question of like, do I want to be a man who doesn't look at porn, or do I want to be the kind of man who doesn't look at porn? And I'm interested in helping people become the kind of person that doesn't do something. Because if all we do is just stop something because of we're not, I think let me start over in that. It's like, it goes back to that prayer I prayed about character development and going the long way. Is I want to help people think through, what kind of person do you want to be? And then how do you align your life and your values and your behaviors and your attitudes and all the dimensions of the human experience to take you in the direction of your vision, or to take you in the direction of that sense of, this is who I am, this is what God has called me to be, and how do we go in that direction? And so I want to help people design lives and relationships where their sexuality is congruent with their values, where their behavior is congruent with their values, and it needs to be so much deeper than just stopping porn or stopping sexual acting out of some way. It's much bigger than it. Anybody who does addiction recovery work recognizes that just stopping the behavior, man, that's just on the surface. Yep. It's like the work beneath that is lifelong, and it's progressive, and it takes time. Yeah. And so I want to help people grapple with that. About 10 years ago, it was soon after I really started working in this area, a friend of mine challenged me. He said, Tim, you stand at the bottom of the cliff and help clean up people that have fallen off. when are you going to get on the top side of the cliff and prevent people from falling? And after a decade or more of working in this area, I was like, I think I have some ideas about how we prevent falling off the cliff. I think I have some ideas that might be helpful for people. And so that's going to be a lot of what people get from this podcast in the next number of episodes. And it's not so much that the podcast is going to be directed about stopping porn or stopping something. It's going to be more about how do we design a life that is congruent to our values. And so if the struggle is in the area of sexuality, you'll find this helpful. If the struggles of life, if it's not about struggles of sexuality, it'll just be about how do I live well and live congruently. And that's what I want the rest of my career to really focus on, of helping people move in that direction.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So you ask about kind of what did I learn? And so this conversation is clearly about my development of becoming a sex addiction therapist. So some of what I learned around sex addiction, around issues of pornography, and sometimes I talk about the struggle with porn as kind of an umbrella term for issues of sexual addiction.
Sure.
Because there's a lot of people who are addicted or use porn addictively, but don't act out sexually in other ways.
Yeah.
But there are very few people who act out sexually in other ways that aren't using porn. And so there's sometimes I just kind of use pornography as kind of an umbrella term for the whole package of struggle. Some people would probably say that's too much of a broad brush, but I think for the most part that can be helpful, because I have had people who have struggled with sexual addictions where porn was not the primary problem, but I don't think I've ever had somebody who would say, yeah, porn's never been part of that equation.
Sure.
And so one of the things that I've learned as I've worked in this space is that we are all children of the problem. And what I learned is that as I listened to people tell me their stories related to their struggle with issues of sexuality, was that I would always find at the root of things is a common human struggle. There's a sense of commonality that I could really resonate with, even if the particular behaviors were confusing to me, or where I was like, man, I have no idea what that would be like. Sure. It's like I've never set foot inside a strip club. However, when I listen to people who talk to me about that particular expression of a problem, it doesn't take me long to recognize that there is something in me that relates to what drives a person to the strip club.
Yeah.
And it goes back to that early story in my late teens, early 20s of that pastor who acted out. I could be me. And there's a theologian or person from long ago that said, "Except by the grace of God, so go I." And I don't remember who made that statement, but I think that becomes one of the compelling postures that I want to take in helping people, is that no matter how dark and deep a person's struggle with sexuality is, except by the grace of God, I could go there. I, left to my own devices, left to my own impulses, if I just nurtured all of my appetites, if I abandoned all sorts of constraints and and I just ran past all sorts of barriers, I could do that. I could get there. And that's an important disposition for people to have, is to recognize our own vulnerabilities. Whether that's in the area of sexuality, I sometimes think about it in terms of like Hitler's Germany. Would I be the kind of person that would just follow along, or will I stand against the forces of injustice? And what kind of it's like, I could go there, I could do that, and it's it requires a spiritual formation process of character development that protects us from going down these pathways that really are unhealthy. And so recognizing that we're the children of the problem is really, really crucial. We all grapple with sexual incongruence. So we all grapple with just the sense of struggle related to what does sexuality mean? How do I express it? How do I express my sexuality in a way that doesn't hurt me or hurt other people? And that's a challenge. Like, we live in a world where that's confusing, and that can be very, very difficult. I also like to think in terms of, and this comes from my Christian faith, and I know there will be many people who don't embrace Christian faith, as well as there are people who will identify as Christians who don't agree with me about my take on sexuality from God's perspective. But when I think about sexuality, I think in terms of, I want to bring my sexuality into alignment with God's creative purpose. And what can I learn from Scripture? What can I learn from the world, from biology, from psychology, from the sciences that help me bring my sexuality into alignment with a higher power or with God? It's like that becomes an essential part of our character development. And so I see God's creative purpose as being personhood. So sexuality is deeply connected to our sense of being a person. We are sexual beings. We are born with sexed bodies. And there is no escaping the reality of our sexual existence. Like, we are sexual beings, and that is foundational within our identity. It's like who I am is deeply connected to my sexuality. And we have to come to terms with that regardless of, I'm not just talking about sexual identity the way it's commonly talked about in terms of LGBT and sexual orientation. Sure. I'm talking about it at a much deeper level than that. We engage the world through sexed bodies and through gender and through all of those issues. Foundationally, we engage the world in that way. And so our personhood is a significant part of that. And as a Christian, I want to bring my personhood into alignment with God's purpose. Sex is procreative by nature. Like, if you look at biology and science, like, the whole point of at least one whole component of sexuality is the propagation of the species. It's like, whether we talk about
how romantic.
Right. It's like that's the nature of plant life, animal life. It's like life gets propagated through a procreative process. And there may be plants or ways in which life gets propagated that's not considered sexual. I don't know. But for, at least at the level of humans and animals and most plants,
at least for mammals,
it's like there's a procreative nature to sexuality. And so how do I bring that into alignment with God's creative purpose for me? I think when we talk about procreative, we're also talking about creativity. And so our sexuality is at the seat of our creativity outside of just sex.
That's interesting.
It's like my interest in art, my interest in that. It's like our sexuality is a significant contributor, or it provides underpinnings into all of these other ways in which creativity gets expressed. Our sex drive and our sexuality is very, very powerful as it drives our sense of productivity. And if you meet anyone whose sex drive is taken away, their ability to be productive is profoundly impacted. Like, look at men who struggle with low T. Like, what you will find is as their testosterone drops, their level of productivity is going to just track right with it. And so it's like our sex drive is way more than just propagation of species. It's about that drive, and the biochemistry of our sexuality is like that sends us off to work. that gives us that sense of we are going to go out into the world and make our fortune. We're going to go out and we're going to express ourselves out in the world, and we're going to be productive. The other aspect I think of God's creative purpose is for pleasure and connection. And so sexuality is deeply pleasurable, unless it's traumatic, unless there's trauma where sex can be very painful. But even like sexual pain is just, it's part of it's on the pleasure continuum. It's like there's a sense in which the opposite of something doesn't, it's like it confirms the element of pleasure. The fact that it can be painful puts it on the pleasure continuum. And so we want our sexuality to be a source of life-giving source of pleasure and connection. And so in marriage, within relationships, sexuality is so critical. Couples often come for therapy because they're struggling with sexuality within their relationship. They're dissatisfied with frequency, with quality, or with the sense of connection. And it's like, if you want a meaningful sex life in marriage, you're going to have to be good friends. Like you're going to have a whole lot more than just the biology of sex. And so pleasure and connection and relational aspects are all part of this process of sexuality. So that's some of what I've learned in terms of being children of the problem. Like all of those things are relevant to all of us, regardless of whether we have sex addiction or not. It's like, no, this is like, part of who we are. Like,
man, we got like 5 more hours of conversation on those things alone.
Oh, sure we do. And I think that when I was thinking about this podcast, I was like, okay, I want to introduce some ideas and concepts. And as time goes along, we'll dive into some of these areas with more depth.
It's helpful to hear those things because it just communicates, oh wow, there is so much more to this than most of us recognize,
Right.
So that's helpful to hear.
Yeah. So as an extension of that, I think about the struggles with sexuality as a deep multivariant issue. So we like to think simplistically in the world. We'd like to think of things through the lens of just one variable. It's either this or it's either that. And it's like, we are generally as a culture pretty intellectually lazy. It's like, we don't like to, thinking's hard work. Thinking well is very hard work. And so if you look at the political landscape, if you look at the polarization within our culture, people don't want to have to think. They just like to know, they'd like to have litmus tests of what do you believe about X? And you tell me what you believe about X, then I'll know if you fit or not. And I'll have my checklist of 5 or 10 things that you have to check the box on these. And if not, now I know where you stand. I know where I stand. I know if you're my enemy or not. I know. And it's like people do that all across the spectrums because we like to be we like to be univariant, or we like to one variable, but struggles with sexuality are multivariant. And I like to think in terms of that this issue of sexuality connects to every dimension of our lives. And so what I just talked about aligning with God's creative purpose is there's some overlap with these, but you can think about 4 or 5 main ways of thinking about variables as it relates to our sexuality. The first one is our body or biology. It's like there's a biology of sex where it's like we learn about the birds and the bees. We learn about genitalia. We learn about just what I would say the sex ed classes in health. It's like this is one way to understand it. It's like if you work on a farm, you're going to learn about the biology of sex and how if you want to have more pigs, you need to make sure these pigs do that so that you get more pigs or more cows or more dogs or more rabbits. It's like that's the biology of sexuality. Then there's the psychology or the mind, the internal processes of our thinking, our emotions, all of those processes are connected to our sexuality. Then there's the social dimension of life or the relationships that we have that are very, very significant in any issues of sexuality, satisfying sex and that which is painful. And then there's the spiritual component of us, and that's the meaning-making place, that sense of how do we make sense of of the world. And so that's a critical area. And then I think in terms of, and this is a controversial term, or there are people that repudiate this term and other people find it really helpful. And that's the sense that the soul of a person connects all of these together. It's like all four of these dimensions are the soul is more than the sum of the parts. It's like if you pull the soul apart, you'll find these four dimensions in there. Like you'll find these things, and yet who are you as a person there's more to you than just those individual components. And so I like to think of the soul as the thing that ties them all together, and so we need to think in terms of all five things. We want to bring congruence to all of them together. So those are what I would say some of the big umbrella things that I've learned as I've done this work professionally, clinically, as well as academically, or in some of the more scholarly work that I've done. Those are some of the themes that have emerged for me.
That's awesome. Well, I'm excited to get into some more of those topics as we keep doing this podcast and talking more. I feel like maybe to kind of wrap up this conversation, might be helpful to share with people what you're thinking about what's next for you and for what you're doing and stuff like that.
Sure. Well, this past summer, I concluded my work and I left my position as a counseling professor. And so I left that university job and returned back to full-time self-employment. So I'm continuing my counseling private practice in Dublin, Ohio. But through the past 6-8 months, I also worked hard and earned certification as a life and executive coach. And so coaching is another way of people helping, but it has a little different emphasis than clinical work. Mm-hmm. And so I'm working to expand my practice or what I offer to people into the coaching world. That's much more focused on future work, like where do I want to go? And so I'm actively creating coaching courses that people can use to really think through what is their vision for their sexuality, and where do they want to go? How do I live a porn-free life? How do I go about doing these things where it's not therapeutically focused, but it's much more in that coaching track?
Sure.
So that's a big transition I'm in the process of making. So I've just launched a new website called drtimstoffer.com that is going to be kind of the repository of all of my work outside of the clinical world. And so people can feel free to check it out. There's also a subscribe button there to get updates on new podcasts and other materials that I'll be offering, because I hope to start creating and producing more useful content on one that will be on the podcast, but also beyond that as well. So I'm also working on my first book. Hey. So I'm excited to do that. So my first book is going to be something related to designing a life that's porn free. That really looks at some of the dimensions that we've talked about and goes into a much more detail related to those, and how do we design, how do we become the kind of person that's not using porn, and in many regards, if somebody does that kind of work, they're going to find that reverberates across the whole dimension of life, and porn is just is almost like it's a symbolic expression of something.
Yes. And I think anyone who's experienced that can understand immediately what you mean by that.
Right. Yeah. And so I sometimes run into the tension of like, I don't want my work to be for people to think about it as so focused on how do we stop a behavior like porn, but more in that sense of I hope my work is accessible and useful for people way beyond those who grapple with issues of pornography. So then I hope to keep the podcast going, and we'll see what comes of that. But that's kind of where I'm headed. So looking forward to kind of keeping the conversations going, and love to hear from the audience, their thoughts, and they certainly can shoot me an email from my new website as well, and so we'll get out more of those materials as we go.
Awesome. Well, Tim, thanks for sharing your story, and I'm sure many people will appreciate hearing that.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Sam. Have a great day.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode of the Dr. Tim Stauffer podcast. If you're finding this podcast beneficial, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Don't forget to check out the show notes where you'll find links to resources and an email address. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, feedback, and topic ideas for future episodes. Thanks for listening.